Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to SA Accounting Academy. Here's a short clip on one of our previous webinars. I hope that you really do enjoy it.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome on this somewhat cool Monday. I think it's cool throughout the entire South Africa. Okay, so let's look at what's on the agenda for today. If we look at the table of contents, like I said, we're going to start off with where did we end with the previous webinar, the one that we had in December, and then also looking back on previous webinars that we did in 2020. If you missed any of those, the webinar recordings are available. And then for today, we're going to be focusing on the basics, looking at what is personal information, the processing of personal information, who are the role players, your compliance checklist, which is probably where I'll be spending the majority of time with you, protection and recovery of data, specific industry considerations, and then just listing the source and bonus documents available. Okay, and then lastly, looking at what's next. So that is our entire contents for today. In terms of the quotes, I always have quotes for the webinars, and today I found two that are very relevant. William Gibson said, "It's impossible to move, to live, to operate at any level without leaving traces but seemingly meaningless fragments of personal information." And it's quite scary because we don't really think about the digital footprint that we leave behind, but we do. Gary Kovacs also spoke about the digital footprint, and he said we are like Hansel and Gretel, leaving behind breadcrumbs of our personal information everywhere we travel through the digital woods. And it's so easy to forget that sometimes. Right. And that's precisely why, because our information is out there, that POPIA exists to protect that personal information. Right. So let's start off now with the basics of POPIA. Let's look at where we ended last time. Last time we looked at the specific industry requirements for personal information. For each one of these sectors, we looked at what personal information do they gather, how long are they allowed to keep it for. The principle is that nobody is allowed to keep your personal information for longer than they need it to. So whatever purpose they need it for, as soon as they are done with it, they need to get rid of that personal information. And that's their POPIA compliance issue. So they must ensure that they've got processes in place to get rid of your personal information and delete it as and when necessary. All right. For COVID-19 specifically, I mean, you've seen when you go into a shopping center or whatever, and they take you, and you obviously sanitize and they take your temperature. I see some people no longer write it down because they don't really need your temperature. All right. The funeral that I attended on Friday, they had to take our temperatures, and they also had to write it down next to our names in the list of attendees. Because remember, with the funerals under the current lockdown rules, we're not allowed to be more than 50. So the funeral parlor has to have their policies and procedures in place to ensure that everybody that was there that got measured. It said they're big, no mask, no entry. Okay. So they had to check for all of that, and there were little tick boxes. When I signed in, I could physically see the little tick boxes that were already completed. So they keep that probably until, I don't know how long they've got to keep it for, but until they no longer need it, and then they also delete it. All right. So I've given you the summaries of all of these. I've included the slides for you at the end of the slideshow as well, just for information purposes. But that's where we ended last time. All right. Which other topics we covered in 2020? We started off in July with the POPIA in a nutshell, which comprised of all the information in detail relating to definitions and all sorts. From that material, I've done the basics of POPIA for you, and it's included in your webinar material for today's webinar. It's also included as a separate source document for you. All right. The number 2 webinar we had was completing your compliance checklist, steps 1 and 2 in detail. We did that on the 6th of August. Webinar number 3 was completing the rest of your compliance checklist, steps 3 to 11. Right. Just a high level overview of that with some detail. Okay. So it was really the majority of last year was spent around the compliance checklist as well as the background and the basics. Okay. Together with reiterating every single time about what it's all about in terms of accountability and who's in charge of doing that. Our fourth webinar dealt with data protection and recovery in a nutshell. And the fifth one that we had, like I said now, the one we had in December was the specific industry considerations. At the end of today's webinar, I've got a similar slide which sets out all the other webinars for the rest of 2021 on the POPIA webinar series that we'll be doing. Okay, so let's quickly look at the recap session. Recap on the basics. This is summarized in your webinar material for you. And as you can see at the bottom, it's also in a separate source document. Okay. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of these items in here. We all know that POPIA came into effect on the 1st of July. The Act basically gives us constitutional right to privacy in South Africa. We have a constitutional right and the Act confirms that. So at that stage, when they said it's effective from the 1st of July, they also said that everybody needs to be compliant by the 30th of June 2021. So most people, when they read that the POPIA Act was now effective, they read, oh yeah, it's in, but okay, man, we've got 12 months to be compliant, so no need to worry about it now. The problem is POPIA applies retrospectively. So you're gonna have to make sure if you have any personal information in place or you've collected any personal information and you are in possession of that on the 30th of June, any processes and procedures relevant to that would be applicable. Now you can ask, how would somebody know if we're not compliant? Because as luck would have it, the Act says we have to report breaches from our side. So if there's any personal information breaches, like remember last year there was a couple of breaches. There was a popular bank, okay, that got hacked. They hacked into their database and they got into the personal numbers of a couple of the banking customers. All right, there's a lot of hacking and stories like that where you know that your personal information is out there and you don't really know who's got it and what they use it for. But I mean, really, it's all about personal information being like a currency nowadays. All right. You need to be compliant as soon as possible, though. So you should already have processes in place. You should already have processes in place to be able to prove your compliance at the end of June. And how you prove compliance is by having, for instance, the checklist completed, having little ticks next to it, having a compliance framework. If it says appoint an information officer, well, have you done that? What processes did you follow to do that? So they are looking for documentary evidence. And when I say they, I mean the information regulator. The information regulator will be regulating information in South Africa. It's as simple as that. All right. So we all know what POPIA stands for. I know some people still say the POPI Act. The information regulators asked specifically that we move away from the POPI Act and just call it POPIA. All right. So POPIA, and if you hear POPI Act, it's the same thing. You just basically, we spell it the same anyway. Just has an additional A on it. But because the information regulator prefers POPIA, that's what we've got it as. That's what we use it as. All right. So that's what it's all about. While POPIA has to give right, they've got to balance the right to privacy against other rights. As we know, the flip side of the coin to personal information and the protection of personal information in South Africa is the access to information. So there is this double-sided coin. We've got the access to information on one side, and we've got the protection of personal information on the other side. At the moment, we've got the Promotion of Access to Information Act, also called the POPIA Act, PAIA, also called the POPIA. Okay. POPIA is Promotion of Access to Information Act.
I hope that you enjoyed that video. For more of our webinar videos, go to www.accountingacademy.co.za. Thank you and have a lovely day.